In 1876, a cowboy in his Sunday best stood beside his favorite horse on the edge of a western town and posed for a photograph. For almost 150 years, it was used as a feel-good image of the Old West, a man and his horse, proud and free. But when the original glass plate was finally scanned and restored, zoom revealed a detail no one had ever seen before. A rope already tied into a noose, hanging just inches above his head. Welcome back to Veins of Darkness, where we restore forgotten photographs and uncover the stories they were never meant to tell. Tonight, we're going to take apart one famous image from 1876, a cowboy and his horse, and follow what restoration revealed about the last hour of his life. If you're drawn to dark histories hiding in plain sight, consider subscribing. We have a lot of photographs left to restore and a lot of secrets left to find. Our story begins with this photograph. For decades, it has circulated under harmless captions. Unknown cowboy with horse, Kansas, circa 1870s. You'll find it in coffee table books on history websites, even framed in themed restaurants. A young man in a brimmed hat and fringed jacket stands with one hand on his hip, the other resting on the neck of a saddled bay horse. Behind them, a rough log fence runs across the frame. In the distance, low false front buildings and a lopsided telegraph pole suggest a frontier town just beginning to take shape on the prairie. The original negative, as far as anyone knew, was long gone. Only second and third generation prints survived, each one a little softer, a little more washed out. In those copies, the cowboy looks relaxed. There's the hint of a smile under his mustache. The horse's ears are forward, almost inquisitive. The light is clean and high, making the whole thing feel like a snapshot of ordinary life in the West. The back of one early print held the only label we had. Luke, Town of Greeley, May 76. No last name, no photographer's stamp, just that single casual scrawl. It was only when the long-forgotten glass plate resurfaced, dusty, cracked, and buried in a filing cabinet in a Colorado courthouse, that anyone realized this image had been something very different from ordinary. Because under the dust, lodged in the shadows and the blown-out sky, the emulsion was still holding details that the old paper prints had never quite picked up. Details that turned a cheerful cowboy photograph into something closer to an execution notice. To understand this photograph, we need to understand where and when it was taken. The year is 1876. On the books, Colorado has just become the 38th state of the United States. The centennial year. The great buffalo herds are vanishing under the guns of hide hunters. Railroads are slicing through the plains, drawing lines of iron toward the Rockies. Towns with names like Greeley, Loveland, and Fort Morgan are springing up along the tracks, each one a handful of streets, a cluster of shacks, a hotel, a saloon, and a limitless promise of land. Life here is hard and precarious. Cattle outfits push herds north from Texas. Small farmers fence off parcels and fight with their neighbors over water. Law, real law, is thin on the ground. A few deputy marshals, a circuit judge who comes through once a season, and a sheriff working on a handshake and a badge. Vigilante justice fills the gaps. Horse theft is a hanging offense, not always by statute, but by custom. So is rustling sometimes. So, in some towns, is looking the wrong way at the wrong man on the wrong night. Newspapers carry regular mentions of men swinging from a cottonwood tree after being taken from custody by persons unknown. Those persons are usually very well known locally. Photography in 1876 has moved beyond the stiff formalities of the 1840s and 50s, but it's still far from casual. Collodion wet plate negatives are the standard. A photographer in a frontier town will have a wagon or a shack where he keeps his chemicals, glass, and darkroom. Clients have to stand still for several seconds while the plate, still wet, captures their image. Getting a photograph taken costs money. A simple carte de visite portrait might be 50 cents to $1. A larger cabinet card, posing with your horse outside, maybe $2 or more, a significant sum for a cowhand earning $30 a month. So when a man in a town like Greeley pays for a photograph with his horse in May 1876, it's an occasion. He wants to mark something. The end of a trail drive. The purchase of a new animal. an engagement, or, sometimes without saying it aloud, the knowledge that death is walking close alongside. And this might be the only trace he leaves behind. The man in the photograph, the one who would be known for a century simply as Luke, did have a last name. The rediscovered records in Weld County give it, Luke Harlan. He was born in 1853 in Missouri, according to an 1875 voter roll entry. The son of a small farmer, third of five. When the Civil War broke out, he was 8. Missouri tore itself apart in guerrilla fighting. By 1870, his family, like many, pushed west with the railroads, chasing stories of rich soil and open range. A brief entry in the 1873 tax rolls for Greeley lists J. Harlan and Sons, with 80 acres unimproved, river bottom, 2 cows. The next year, only the father's name appears. Local gossip preserved in a 1930s pioneer reminiscence suggests that of the Harlan boys, 2 stayed to help with farming and 1, Luke, went to riding cattle, could never stand a fence. By 1875, he was working as a drover for the McFadden outfit, moving longhorns up from Texas to the railheads. A pay ledger from that company, now in the Colorado State Archives, has him down as L. Harlan Hand, $30 per month, plus found. Cowboy work is seasonal and brutal. Long days in the saddle, nights sleeping on the ground. Flash floods, stampedes, lightning striking the herd. Harlan, if he was like most of his peers, would have drifted between outfits, saloons, and occasional trouble. What brings him to Greeley in the spring of 1876 is noted in a line in the county's district court docket. On May 18, 1876, a complaint was filed, State versus Luke Harlan, for the theft of 1 bay gelding, property of J. H. Owens. The margin notes say arrested and bailed to circuit court, June term. The bay gelding in the photograph, the one Luke stands beside with his hand on its neck, matches the description in the complaint. Star on forehead, white sock on the near hind leg. So the picture we're looking at was not, as later generations like to imagine, a carefree portrait taken for fun. It was made while Luke was under accusation, waiting to stand trial for horse theft in a town where, guilty or not, that label could kill you. The date scratched into the plate confirms it, May 20th, 1876. 2 days after the complaint, 2 weeks before the circuit judge was due to arrive. Why would a man in that position pay good money to have his picture taken with the very horse said to be stolen? That question would not start to make sense until the glass plate came to light and the noose appeared. The technology that captured Luke's likeness was both crude and, in its way, incredibly sharp. Wet plate collodion negatives used on glass had to be coated, exposed, and developed within minutes. Out on the plains, a photographer like the man who ran Greeley's Hayes and Son photographic artists would set up a tent or use the back of a studio shed, mixing flammable collodion, sensitizing the glass in a silver nitrate bath, then rushing it into the camera while it was still wet. The upside of this complicated process was detail. If you did it right, the silver crystals in that thin layer on the glass could record unbelievably fine information. Hairs, scratches, the weave of cloth, the grain in a board. The downside was fragility. Glass breaks, emulsion cracks. Over time, prints made from those negatives fade, pick up stains, lose contrast. That's what happened with the familiar cowboy and horse prints. They were probably made decades after 1876 from a damaged plate. Each generation of copying lost a little more. In the 21st century, modern conservators can undo some of that loss. High-resolution scanning, digital contrast enhancement, and even carefully used AI-based reconstruction software can bring back what the human eye once saw on the original. But it only works if the original survives. In this case, the glass plate sat unnoticed for more than a century in a gray metal filing cabinet in the basement of the Weld County Courthouse, tucked into a folder marked Exhibit B, State versus Harlan. It was evidence in a case that never made it to a full trial. When the courthouse was cleared for renovation in 2019, a clerk doing a final sweep opened the cabinet, saw the brittle manila folder, and instead of throwing it out, sent it to the County Historical Society for possible interest. That's how in 2022, It landed on the desk of photographic archivist Daniel Ruiz at the Colorado State Historical Museum. Daniel's job was to stabilize, scan, and describe it. He had no idea, when he first held the dusty plate up to the light, that it would rewrite the story of an image millions of people had glanced at and forgotten. "Let's take a closer look," he wrote in his notes. And that was where everything started to shift. On the scanner, the negative's true content became clear. In the raw, inverted image, Daniel saw Luke as no one had in generations. Young, maybe 23, lean under his loosely buttoned jacket. His hat sat low on his brow, shadowing his eyes. His hand on the horse's neck was calloused, veins prominent. The horse itself was in better focus than in any print. Coarse hairs, scuffed leather bridle, that distinctive star on the forehead. Three things stood out even before he touched any sliders. First, Luke's posture. In the center of the frame, he stood ramrod straight, not with the casual slouch of a trail hand, but with the unnatural, heel-to-toe alignment of someone braced. The line of his back from hip to shoulder was almost too straight, as if some invisible board held him there. Second, his face. Unlike the softened, almost smiling expression on the common print, the scanned negative revealed tension. The corners of his mouth were turned down a fraction. His jaw muscle bulged slightly. His eyes were dark, the catchlight small, almost pinprick. Third, the background. What on prints looked like empty sky washed over behind him now, under enhanced contrast, showed faint horizontal and vertical lines, like the outline of some structure barely visible. Daniel made a rough crop around Luke's head and shoulders and bumped up the contrast. "Notice the shadows," he wrote. "Under brim, under jawline. Expression appears more anxious than confident." He circled the area just above Luke's right shoulder where, in the washed-out prints, nothing much could be seen. At this stage, there was only a hint, a slightly darker curve crossing the pale sky. It could have been a flaw in the emulsion, or it could be the first trace of the rope. But look closer, he told himself, and enhance slowly. The first restoration step was simple, correct for age. Daniel adjusted the levels to bring the blacks back to black and the whites back to white. He reduced the yellow cast from the old varnish, evened out some of the more obvious streaks from dried developer. Grain popped, edges sharpened. Already, the photograph changed character. Details of Luke's clothes emerged, missing top button on his jacket, frayed cuff, faint dark stain on his left thigh that might have been old blood or just trail dirt. More telling were his hands. On the print, his fingers had always looked relaxed, casually spread. In the restored scan, you could see they were digging in a little, tendons taut, knuckles pale against the horse's dark coat. His other hand, resting on his hip, was clenched, thumb tucked into his belt in a way that might pass for bravado at a distance, but up close looked like someone holding onto something hard, maybe because there was nothing else solid in his life to grip. He seemed suddenly less like a myth and more like a young man caught in a moment he did not entirely control. The background lines sharpened too. Behind Luke's head, slightly to the right, a cross beam resolved itself against the bright sky. Another beam rose vertically from it, forming a rough, inverted L shape. On the upright, something hung down in a pale arc, blurred by time. It was still impossible to make it out clearly. It might have been a strap on a telegraph pole. It might have been a sagging wire. Or it might have been the thing Daniel already half suspected, the loop of a rope. He marked the area for deeper work. "One area still needs more," he wrote. Upper right quadrant behind subject, structure, and hanging object indistinct. For the next phase, he turned to tools that didn't exist in 1876. AI-assisted enhancement. He fed the high-resolution scan into a model trained on thousands of historic photographs, software designed not to invent new content, but to infer missing edges and reduce noise, making real but faint detail more legible. On the first pass, it cleaned the emulsion grain and flattened out some of the cracks. The image looked almost too smooth, so Daniel dialed back the effect until the original texture returned, but the underlying form stood out. Then he focused the algorithm on specific regions. The software sharpened eyelashes, deepened pupils, and disturbingly, made the asymmetry of his expression clearer. His left brow was raised a fraction higher than the right. The skin between his eyes, and his nose line showed a crease that looked a lot like fear. "Wait," Daniel murmured, leaning closer. "Is that?" He enhanced the area just under the brim again. On the inner corner of his left eye, a tiny, darker track curved down along the top of his cheek. It was so faint that it disappeared if you zoomed out, but at 400% it was there, a thin, uneven line. A dried tear. Not the glamorized cowboy of posters, but a young man who, a minute before the plate was exposed, might have wiped his face quickly on his sleeve and hoped nobody saw. He let that sit for a moment. Then he turned the software toward the background. As the algorithm iterated, what had been a vague smudge coalesced. The horizontal line became clearly a timber, not a wire. Rough-hewn wood, edges slightly notched. The vertical, which had seemed a pole, now showed a fork at the top, the kind of joint carpenters used when making a frame to bear weight. And from that fork, in front of the pale sky, the curve hanging down was no longer abstract. The AI sharpened its edge used on glass where the original emulsion exposed and developed within minutes. A thick three-strand rope tied a photographer like the man the outline of a not visible on one graphic artist would set up a tent or use the back of a studio clear against mixing flammable collodion. The photograph's entire meaning in a silver nitrate bath. But there were more layers rushing it into the camera. First, while it was still wet, Daniel examined the upside of this complicated process. His jacket fell in a straight line. If you did it right, the silver crystals in that thin layer horizontal lines at his wrist under the sleeve, fine just where hands met cuffs, hairs, scratches, tiny creases, the indented the fabric, the grain in parallel grooves. The downside was his hands were not relaxed at his sides. Emulsion cracks. They were bound over time, loosely enough to hide made from those negatives fade, tightly enough pick up to leave their trace in lose contrast. Second, that's what happened with the familiar cowboy around the animal's chest. Partly probably made decades another rope after 1876, running from the saddle damage forward and then up each generation of in the same direction a little more. In the 21st century arrangement, modern conservators can undo one end of the rope around the condemned man's neck, digital contrast enhancement to something solid. And even carefully used AI-based reconstruction software can bring back what the human eye once saw on the original that were not from casual standing. It only works if the original survives. Deeper than a man in this would make by shifting his weight unnoticed for a photograph for more than a century, as though something heavy had been dragged there in the basement of the Weld County Courthouse, as though man had stomped into a folder marked Exhibit B. Finally, he widened the crop beyond the edge of the common case that never made it to a full trial. To the right of the courthouse was just cleared for renovation in 2019. Three figures, a clerk doing a final sweep, opened the cabinet, as if trying, saw the being told manila folder to stay and instead of throwing it out, send it to the county historical society for another slightly larger. That's how in 2022 pinned to it landed on the desk of photographic archivist Daniel Ruiz, barely more than at the Colorado State Historical Museum. What might have been a rifle. Daniel's job was to stabilize, in the upper scan, faint but legible. He had no idea when he first held the dusty plate up to the light, that it would rewrite the story of an image millions of people had glanced at. This wasn't just a cowboy showing off his horse. He wrote in his man made to stand in front of the very animal everything started to shift that would hang him on the scanner. Watched by the negatives, law, true content warning became clear. Moments in the raw inverted image, Daniel saw Luke. The photograph as was no one having generation. A death warrant, young, maybe 23. The caption "Cowboy under his loosely had always been at best. His hat sat low on his brow. Now that the restored photo gave us context, his hand on the horse's neck was what exactly happened on that day in May 1876 was in better focus than in any newspaper. Coarse hairs scuffed provided part of the answer. That distinctive star on the 27th issue. Three things stood out even on the second page any slide. The headline. First, Luke's posture meets his face. In the center of the frame, on Friday last, ramrod it began not with the casual slouch of a trailhand's outfit, but with the unnatural deserts of his crimes near the stockyards of someone braced. The line of his back had been apprehended earlier and was almost too straight, with a bay gelding as if some invisible board to Mr. J. H. Owens. Second, although some of his fellows spoke in his softened, almost smiling expression to many citizens, the scanned article went on to describe how, in the corners of his mouth were turned down a fraction, and his jaw muscle bulged slightly. A committee of townsmen had convened to deal with the almost pinprick. Third, ignoring the efforts of Sheriff Collins to persuade them to await the sky washed over behind him now, said under enhanced contrast, the prisoner to showed faint horizontal and vertical lines, where after permitting him to say some structure barely and to be photographed, Daniel made a rough crop around Luke's head and shoulders by hanging him up until he was dead. Notice the shadows for posterity. Under brim, the phrase under worked like a key. Expression, the ledger appears more anxious than which confident. Daniel had also been given with the area just above contained a brief right shoulder wear. In the washed-out prints, hand nothing much could be seen. May 20th, at this stage, Harlan, there was only a hint. Standing with a slightly darker curve, crossing the pale sky by Citizens Committee. It could have been a flaw. One plate only. $3 gold. It could be the first trace penciled later. Perhaps when the albumin print had begun to circulate as a generic cowboy image, the first restoration step was simple. Cowboy with correct for age. The same ledger Daniel adjusted the levels to bring the black 2 days later to black from Mrs. J. and the whites back to white. One copy he reduced the yellow cast from the old varnish. Even out some of the more obvious streaks, or perhaps his dry developer, had obtained a grain pop of the photograph of their son in the hours before his death changed for character. The details of Luke's clothes emerged. They would have known that his button on his jacket, that the noose above him was not a stain on his left thigh that might have been old blood, that the men standing just off frame were not telling were his hands, but his executioners. His fingers had always looked relaxed, hardened, casually and later generations in a restored picture, you could see they were digging in a little safer version took over. Knuckles pale and his horse's dark coat. Your great uncle, his other hand, who was always on his hip, riding somewhere. A family might omit that the last place he rode was up onto a distance, under a tree, but up close looked like someone holding onto something hard. As for what maybe because there was nothing else solid in his life, the Tribune offers, he seemed suddenly less like a myth and more like a young man caught in a moment he did not entirely that he had come by the horse. The background line sharpened too, and that folks behind Luke's haste, slightly to the right, were shouted down by those resolved itself. There is no indication he received another anything like vertically from it. Of his guilt examined before he was killed. Shape. The sheriff's notebook. Something hung down among his grandson's papers, blurred by time. One bitter line. It was still impossible to make it out clearly. Boys wanted blood. It might have been a strap brought in on a telegraph to take picture. It might have been a sagging wire, tender-hearted, or it might have been the thing Daniel already, God help us, suspected. The court record for State versus Harlan. He marked the area ends abruptly with the word one area still needs more. Without a defendant, upper right quadrant behind subject. The docket notes that the cost of burial was indistinct by family. For the next phase, the Harlans turned to tools that didn't exist in after that in official documents. AI-assisted an 1878 tax roll the high-resolution scan into a model trained on thousands of historic photographs. A voter list from 1880 has his name, new content, but no longer any male Harlan of Luke's age. In 1889, but a small notice in the Tribune records the death of Mrs. J. Harlan. It cleaned the emulsion grain and flattened out some of the cracks. And mother. The image looked almost too smooth. Long-time so Daniel dialed back the effect until the original texture reunited with her sons, but the underlying form stood out. Gone before. Then he focused the algorithm. There is no mention of horse theft, of the software sharpened eyelashes, deep in it was in a different box and disturbingly given to the historical society of his expression by a Harlan descendant. His left brow was raised a fraction higher than the right. A letter undated between his eyes, and his nose line showed a crease by Luke's younger sister, like Eliza. To a cousin back in Daniel murmured, leaning closer. Do you remember our Luke? Is that? Wrote. He enhanced the area you have just of him under the brim with a sorrel horse. On the inner corner of his left day, they hung him. A tiny, dark backtrack, think of it, curved down along the top of his cheek. But I see it was so faint that it disappeared if you zoomed out. Mama kept that card on the mantle till the day she died. A thin, never telling, the little one's the whole of it. Not the glamorized to remember that he stood up straight, but a young man who, and that he loved that animal more than any man might have wiped his face quickly. When you look at his sleeve, do not think only Cowboy. He let also boy they did not give a chance. Then he turned the software oral history collected in the 1930s zoom into by a works progress administration and curve includes a story algorithm told by one of the men what had been a teenager in Greeley in 1876. The horizontal line we all went out to see the timber, not a wire. It was like a holiday. Hedges was there with his camera. The vertical, which had seemed to stand with that showed a fork and took his likeness. The kind of joint I remember him crying when making a frame. And some feller told him to be mad from that fork and stand in front of the pale sky. After they pulled the curve hanging down was no longer abstract and near tore the branch off. By early summer of 1876, Luke Harlan was in an unmarked grave somewhere outside Greeley, one of many men in that decade whose lives ended at the end of a rope on the authority of citizens' committees. His horse, according to Owens's ledger, was sold on, quietly, to another rancher. It lived out its life under a new name. No one ever put its image on a book cover. The negative of Hayes's photograph stayed in the courthouse files because, technically, it was evidence. The family's card print moved from mantle to drawer to a shoebox, losing its sting as those who had known Luke died. In the 20th century, A careless researcher copied the card, stripped of its handwritten note, and published it in a volume on life on the western frontier with a bland caption, "Cowboy with Horse, c. 1870s." From there, it drifted into the image banks, scanned, reprinted, color-tinted, made into posters. Its origin story blurred into nothing more than old photo, unknown cowboy. Only with the resurfacing of the glass plate and the careful work of restoration did the full frame become visible again. The noose, the bound wrists, the watching men, the sign warning away thieves and murderers. The photograph had always contained those things. Our copies simply lacked the resolution and perhaps the willingness to see them. Now, in the museum's climate-controlled storage, the plate is preserved in a custom box. Its catalog entry does not let it revert to myth. It calls Luke by his full name. It notes the lynching. It connects the image to the date, the family, the crime alleged but never tested in court. When the restored version is displayed, the caption does not talk about romance of the West. It talks about summary justice, about the thin line between law and murder on the frontier, about how communities use images to soothe their consciences or rewrite their own brutality. This photograph, this single image we've restored, is no longer just a cowboy with his horse, the curator's label concludes. It is a record of a life cut short, a warning about the stories we accept at face value, and a reminder that the camera often sees more than we are ready to know. Stories like this remind us that history is not just dates and battles. It is also the small, sharp moments when a community decides who belongs and who doesn't, who is worth the benefit of the doubt, and who can be dropped from a branch with a rope around his neck. For decades, we looked at Luke's photograph and saw what we wanted to see: a handsome cowboy, hat-tipped, standing with his horse under a wide western sky. We didn't see the noose. We didn't see his clenched hands. We didn't see the men in the shadows, or the sign preaching a morality they did not themselves follow. Restoring old photographs is not just about cleaning up scratches or bringing out faces. It's about bringing back uncomfortable truths, about giving people like Luke their real stories back, even if those stories tell us things we'd rather not hear about our past. The mission of this channel, and of the archivists and conservators behind the scenes, is simple. Look closer. Ask what's just out of frame. Ask whose voice is missing. Because the picture is rarely as simple as the caption. If this journey from a cowboy poster to a lynching photograph made you look at old images differently, you're exactly the kind of viewer Veins of Darkness is for. We restore and investigate one photograph at a time, pulling on every thread until the story behind the image is as clear as we can make it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. An apparently innocent Victorian school portrait where one child was already dead before the shutter clicked. Thank you for watching, for staying through the hard parts, and for being willing to see more than just the surface. Until the next macabre tale, stay curious about the darkness.